was victimised for fighting against cuts and privatisation in 2007, and we launched a massive campaign in defence of my job that was a defence of mental health services in this city that were in a terrible state then, where people were being sent to Darlington and to Bradford and to all over the place when they needed to be in hospital because there weren't enough hospital beds here, and they were trying to cut community services even more. And I think that campaign to defend my job was a defence of those services and that fight back, and for the people who use the services jointly with the people who worked for services against the people who thought balancing the budget was the most important thing. And I think what's sad is that we're 7 years, 8 years down the line from that, and actually those services are even worse than they were then, and that what was a terrible situation in Manchester has now become the norm for the health service right across England. And I think the fact that this government have used an economic crisis that's not of our making, but is of the bankers' making, to destroy what they never wanted in the first place, which is our health service, our education service, the benefits, legal aid, all the welfare rights and state that we took for granted. I think they are using this economic crisis to get rid of it. They're talking about having a state, a government, that is the same size or smaller than it was in the 30s before we had a welfare state. And I think that's a very deliberate thing that they're doing. It's not an accident. It's not a sort of, something that they've been forced into. It's a choice that they're making. And it's a choice that has absolutely devastating consequences for people who use those services, who fought for it, who work for it, who want to live their old age in peace and without living in starvation, who when they get ill don't want to be terrified about being in pain when they have a child at this sort of, have we got a shilling to take them to the doctor? We are going back to those dark ages if we let them get away with it. They've cut £20 billion from the health service over the course of this government. 4% sort of, extra each year has been cut, which is why this year the crisis is so big that even they can't hide it, desperately as they are to hide it and to try and shut us up and to stop us speaking out. So every day you see another health service crisis. All the consultants in one A&E resigned because they said we cannot run this A&E safely. We asked for things to make it safe and they refused to give it us, so we're not working here anymore because it's not safe. There are people queuing up. I was talking to a manager who was saying that there was a colleague of hers who was up all night because there's not a single bed in England for somebody who was on a section who was waiting in a police cell. Not a single bed in the whole of England for them until the very next day, and that bed was in Milton Keynes for somebody who lived in Bolton. We've been using seclusion rooms for people to sleep in. We're using day sort of living rooms for people to sleep in because we don't have the services, because 2,000 beds have been cut in mental health. And the problem is that we're faced with an opposition, so-called opposition from the Labour Party, who haven't really got anything very different. I think they would be better than the Tories, to be honest, but I don't, they'll be £2.5 billion better, but that's 10% of what's been cut, which is just not enough to do anything to undo the damage that this government has done. And unfortunately, although they say that they want the NHS to be a preferred provider, they actually want to keep the whole market mechanism in place. And Alison Pollock has calculated that that will cost 20% of the NHS budget if we keep the market in place. So we could immediately, like that, if we scrapped the market where we buy and sell and contract and did that, we could immediately put more than that £20 billion straight back in without having to take a single penny off the people who've got richer and richer whilst we've got poorer and poorer. Never mind if we take the money off the rich as well, which I'm in favour of doing both. It's not one or the other. And I suppose that my problem is I think we have an election where those arguments are just not put. They're not put by the mainstream parties. So people don't hear them on the television, they don't hear them on question time. They think it's a choice of austerity or austerity with a little bit less austerity. And I think that becomes where it's harder for people to see there's an alternative. So I think us standing in the election is partly about standing up for all those people who want something different, to say it is possible. There is an argument, there is a legitimate legitimate alternative way of running the world that we live in, and it can be fought for and won, and we're standing, not because I think that the people on this table are the great and the good and that we can win it for you, but actually we need to organise and mobilise people and win them to building together to do that. And I think part of standing is saying, let's try and create an alternative left-wing organisation that actually is going to be prepared to fight and do that. I'm a trade unionist, and I think time and time again, my trade union alongside other trade unions have unfortunately felt that it was more important to fight to get a Labour government elected than it was to stand up for their members and ordinary working class people. We've just had a strike over our pay. We got offered 1% or 0% depending on what grade you were on. And despite the fact that we had 2 really good strikes, it looks like they're now going to settle that because it was embarrassing the Labour government, potential sort of Miliband, when we were on picket lines and he was asked to support us. And I think that's a problem where the opportunities say we can have a different world. By fighting together we can get that different world, but we're not want you to do it because we think the Labour Party are more important. And I think that's the other reason why it's important to stand, because I think that standing together is something that we need to fight for. The health service in some ways was built on the basis of immigration. My parents are both immigrants. My mum came to this country in the very early 50s in order to be part of an NHS that wouldn't have survived if we hadn't recruited from all over the world. There were lots of German, Italian, Irish, Afro-Caribbean, and now all across the world people who've come and helped to build and sustain our health service, and will continue to fight to keep our health service. 40% of nurses in England are immigrant workers and 25% of doctors. If we did what UKIP wanted and we sent those people back, our health service would close down tomorrow. It would not be able to function at all. And I think that sense of, again, finding a political party that stands up and says that, and says we welcome those people. I welcome my parents, I welcome all the other immigrants who I work with, who I live with, who make the world a better place, not a worse place. It's not us and them in terms of immigrants and us, it's us and them in terms of the rich. The richest man in Britain, I think he's the Duke of Westminster, has as much wealth as the bottom 10% of the population, one person. And they say there isn't enough money to provide the health service and social services. And I just think we have to say there is if we take that money off them. And I think, you know, that the council now looks like it's going to take over the health service as if sort of putting together 2 services which have been starved of money is going to solve the problem when they've both been starved of money. I mean, one of the reasons they claim that we're in the mess that we are is that there's far too many old people because we're living longer. And we should really have just worked and died like we used to instead of worked and then had a little bit of pension years and then died. And we're all doing it all wrong, and it's costing us far too much money. But in fact, in this government, there are 850,000, that's nearly 1 million elderly people less getting social care than did when this government started. So they say there's more elderly people and it's costing us a fortune, but actually less of them are getting the care than used to. And I think that's just got to stop. And I think we're standing to say that's got to stop, and we're trying to mobilise and unite people. And we may or we may not win. I'm not saying that we're necessarily going to win, but winning the election isn't the be-all and end-all. It's about putting a flag, a marker on the ground to say there is an alternative world possible. And unless we start to fight for that alternative world, there isn't an alternative to it just getting more horrible and more people dying and more people being persecuted and beaten up, more wars, more death and destruction. That's the route we go down if we don't fight for that alternative. And that's why I think our view is popular, and I think we have to go out and fight for every vote that stands up that's a kick in the teeth from austerity or from the Tories, austerity light from Labour, or austerity with a huge dollop of populist racism from UKIP.